Okay, so in this lecture, our first question of interest is going to be, how does emotion affect our memory for events and experiences in our life, right? So what is the relationship between emotion and one's ability to recall various events and episodes throughout their life? And then for the rest of the lecture, we're going to talk about a particular type of emotionally valenced memory called a flashbulb memory. So we're going to first define what flashbulb memories are, and then we're going to talk about how these particularly specialized emotional memories differ from sort of normal memories. And we're also going to talk about why they occur. So what is the particular mechanism that produces flashbulb memories? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so in general, when we look at the relationship between emotion and memory, it makes sense to conclude that whenever particular events are valenced with emotion, your memory for those events is going to be better. So said differently, anytime a particular memory has strong emotion associated with it, either positive or negative, then it's going to be easier for you to recall that memory. And there's a lot of different potential mechanisms for why we see this enhancement of emotional memories. So one potential reason has to do with a process called consolidation. So we haven't really talked about consolidation a lot before, but it's essentially just the idea that typically while we sleep, our brains actually have neural mechanisms that help to solidify, if you will, our representations for events and experiences that we've had on the previous day. And so one of the ways that these neural connections are forged and strengthened is through activity in the amygdala, which you guys know is obviously associated with emotional processing. Okay, so it's possible that because the amygdala is often evoked in this neural process, or this process of forging neural connections based on our events and experiences, that might be why we see an enhancement for emotional memories. Another potential reason is that the amygdala and the hippocampus are both part of the limbic system. So they're actually, in terms of their placement in the brain, they're structures that are directly adjacent with one another. And so oftentimes they are both activated in the processing and creation of emotional memories. So whenever we have more than one neural structure, if you will, kind of acting together, we would expect to see superior activation or a more sort of robust representation in the mind, right? So generally, it's fair to say that due to a variety of different reasons or mechanisms, that anytime you have a memory with emotion associated with it, it's going to be enhanced or more recallable. And that this enhancement for emotional memories is actually going to get better with time or more intense with time. Okay, so what evidence do we have of this enhancement? Well, I have the results of two experiments for you here. So they're very, very similar, which is why I put them on the same slide. But in this first experiment, the Labar and Phelps 1998 experiment, participants were either given what are called taboo words. So, right, a taboo is something that is not generally accepted in a given culture. So it might include the use of sexually explicit material or otherwise profane material. Or it would just be neutral words that aren't expected to initiate any sort of emotional response. And what they found is that when they looked at the percentage of the total words recalled in these participants, there was a significant enhancement effect for the taboo words or the emotionally valenced words, right? So we have about a 55% rate of recall for the emotional words versus a 25% recall rate for the neutral words. So quite a robust effect there. And then the next experiment, the Dalcroze et al. 2005 experiment, was very similar, except instead of using words in this case, they used pictures that either denoted something, again, valenced with emotion, either something that was, very graphic, denoting an accident, or something that would be very upsetting, or just something neutral like a bowl of fruit or something like that. They found that people's memory for the pictures was much better when it had an emotional component to it. So again, basically the idea is that anytime there are emotions involved in the processing of memories, that information is going to be easier to recall later on. Okay, so we've talked about the general relationship between emotion and memory. So let's talk more about maybe what's happening in the brain when we process emotional material. Okay? So I mentioned before that one of the reasons that emotional content is more memorable is that it involves co-activation of both the amygdala and the hippocampus, right? So let's look at a particular study that demonstrated this. So as you guys have seen many different times before, in many different contexts throughout this course, one of the best ways that scientists can investigate questions within cognitive psychology is by looking at differences in cognition between people who have sustained some kind of brain damage as compared to healthy controls, right? So this is that sort of study. So this particular study looked at healthy individuals and compared them to individuals who had sustained damage to the emotional processing center of the brain or to the hippocampus, or excuse me, to the amygdala. Right? So the particular patient that they talk about in this particular study is referred to by his initials, which are BP. So BP had sustained irreplicable damage to his amygdala. Okay? So they compared BP's performance on this particular task to individuals who had not damaged their amygdala. So the particular task that BP and the healthy controls had to do in this particular study is they watched a video, okay? And there were actually two different conditions. So in the emotional processing condition, they watched a video that included the following sequence of events. Right? So it started out with a mother and a little boy walking to the hospital where the little boy's father worked as a laboratory technician. Okay, so they're walking to the hospital to visit the father. And in one case, as they're crossing the street, the little boy gets hit by a car and his feet basically get amputated. And so throughout the course of the film, it shows the little boy being hit by a car, and all of the medical professionals being called in to take the boy to the hospital and perform emergency surgery to reattach the severed feet. And the whole time, of course, there's concerns about the little boy, and his, obviously his life is in danger and so forth. So it's obviously highly emotional content. Okay, and then eventually the surgeons are able to reattach the feet. And at the end of the movie, there's a whole sequence where the father stays with the boy at the hospital, and then the mother has to call the preschool to arrange to pick up the older child that's not present in the film. Okay, so we have an unemotional sequence of events when they're right before they're crossing the street, a highly emotional sequence of events while the boy is having the collision with the car and having this emergency surgery, and then the unemotional content again, the sort of mundane event where the mother is calling the preschool. Okay, so that's the emotional valenced video. And then there's also a control video where instead of getting hit by a car, it just talks about them walking, and sort of seeing all the different components of the hospital. And while they're walking through the hospital administrators are engaging in a disaster drill, right? So it's a similar sort of thing, except in this case, no one gets hurt. They're just preparing for the possibility of someone being injured. Right? So what the researchers wanted to determine in this case is they wanted to see how memories for the emotional content compared to the more neutral aspects of the video. Okay, and what they found is that when individuals like BP, so what they found is that individuals who had not sustained damage to their amygdala, or individuals without brain damage, showed a very clear enhancement effect for the emotional part of the story when this little boy is injured. Okay, so compared to the individuals like BP who had sustained brain damage, the healthy controls showed a very prominent enhancement effect where their memory was best for the emotionally valenced content. Okay. However, individuals like BP who had sustained damage to their amygdala showed similar rates of recall for the first part of the story that didn't include an emotional component. But he did not show an enhancement effect for the emotional part, right? So most people see a spike in recall as they transition from the first part of the story to the more emotional part in the middle, but individuals who had sustained damage to the amygdala did not show that enhancement effect. Okay, so what this suggests is that emotions, by activating the amygdala, help us to better recall highly emotionally valenced content, right? So one of the reasons why we're better at remembering emotional content is because we have that activation of the amygdala. Right? So when that region of the brain is damaged or absent, we no longer show that emotional enhancement or that enhancement for emotional memories. Okay, so here's more evidence that emotions enhance memory, but it's also looking at the effect of stress. So in this particular experiment, like the ones I showed you previously, they either showed participants emotionally arousing images or neutral images that weren't expected to have an emotional component. So in addition to assessing memory for those different types of images, they also compared individuals who had undergone stress to individuals that weren't, that did not encounter a stressor. So in this case, in the stress condition, obviously we can't expose participants to an actual stressful event or an actual, stressful experience that they themselves would experience. But we can do sort of a comparable manipulation in the laboratory. So in this case, what they did to create something analogous to the physiological arousal that characterizes stress is participants in the stress condition had to submerge their hand in ice water for a few seconds, right? So because this is a painful, very intense stimulus, it often triggers the same physiological mechanisms that get activated, for example, during the fight or flight response, right? So basically, they were trying to trick the body into activating the particular systems that are responsible when you encounter a stressful event, right? And so what they found is that there was no difference in recall for the neutral pictures when they compared participants who had experienced a stressor and participants who hadn't, right? So if you look at the graph here, we compare emotional and neutral pictures. So between participants who had experienced a stressor or not, right? So looking at the neutral pictures or the purple bars on the graph, we see that there's not much of a difference. So participants in the stress and no stress conditions didn't really differ at all in their later recall of the neutral images. However, participants in the stress condition showed a very clear enhancement effect for the emotionally valenced pictures, right? So now if you look at the orange or reddish bars, we see that it's much, much higher, about 55% for the stressful pictures as compared to about 42% for the no stress condition. Okay, so basically, again, participants exposed to a stressor seem to have heightened memory for the emotional pictures as compared to individuals who had not been exposed to a stressor. Right? So just like the previous study suggested that one of the reasons for enhanced memory, when that memory includes emotion, is because of activation of the amygdala, this particular study seems to suggest that another mechanism underlying superior memory for emotionally valenced events is the fact that emotionally valenced events often invoke the body's systems that respond to stressors, right? So somehow activating the fight or flight system seems to trigger enhanced encoding for emotional events. Okay. So again, just to recap, we seem to have a natural enhancement effect or a natural innate ability to better encode emotional memories as compared to neutral or non-emotional memories, perhaps due to consolidation, perhaps due to activation of the amygdala, and perhaps due to activation of the body's fight or flight response that happens during times of stress, right? But emotional memories lead to better recall than non-emotional memories. Okay, so that concludes our first objective of the lecture. And the second question that we will answer today are questions about what are called flashbulb memories, right? So if I were to, for example, if you guys were to ask me, where were you when you first learned about the 9/11 or the terrorist attacks on 9/11, right? Well, unlike most of you, right, I am 32 years old, so I was alive during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I was about 13 years of age. So if you were to ask me where I was when I heard about the 9/11 attacks, I would probably tell you that I was in the 7th grade, and that I remember that particular day because it was picture day. So the prior evening, my mother had taken me to JCPenney's to buy a new outfit for picture day, and I was excited to wear my new outfit and, you know, makeup and everything else to get my picture taken. And I was also excited because on that particular day, on September 11th, we were going to dissect an earthworm in my life science class. Right? So I was really excited to, you know, I was a science nerd and I was really excited about dissecting the earthworm, right? And if you were to ask me how confident I was that this account was accurate, right? I would say very, very confident. And in fact, this was the exact account that I gave my colleagues who were investigating flashbulb memories when I was in graduate school. And I don't have the data in front of me, but I do remember giving a very detailed account and being fairly confident in that account. However, when I was pressed to check the accuracy of this account, I realized that almost every detail that I had supplied was false. So it turns out that I was not in 7th grade when the 9/11 attacks occurred. I was in 8th grade. And I wasn't in my life science class. I was in my world geography class, right? So why on earth had I mixed up all of these details, particularly for such an emotionally valenced event? Okay, well, that's what we're going to talk about, right? So we're going to talk about these particular events, which refer to, are these particular types of memories, which refer to one's memory for an unexpected, highly emotional event. So not the event itself, but the events surrounding the circumstances in which they heard about the event. Okay? So these so-called flashbulb memories are referred to as such because they refer to our memory for circumstances surrounding highly publicized, highly emotional national events, or basically tragedies that occur on a national scale. Okay, so Brown and Kulik were very prominent cognitive psychologists who first discovered this type of memory, and they refer to them as flashbulb memories, basically because for an instant, the entire nation, okay, and perhaps the world at large basically stops, right? So collectively, throughout the nation or throughout the world, we're just kind of mutually stunned, almost as though the world stops turning long enough to have its picture taken. Okay? So the notion is that flashbulb memories occur for highly publicized, unexpected, often tragic events that sort of stun the whole world. Okay? And these are particularly events that, again, are highly publicized or prominently featured in the media. Right? So common examples are, of course, 9/11 most recently, but also the assassination of John F. Kennedy or the assassination of Martin Luther King, or something that occurred in the late 1980s with the launching of the spacecraft, the Challenger, that was subsequently kind of fell apart, and all of the astronauts on board were killed. Okay, so that's what flashbulb memories refer to. Okay, so again, flashbulb memories are not really memories for the event itself, but rather the circumstances surrounding how a person heard about the particular event. Okay, and there are some universally established characteristics for these particular types of memories. Okay, so as I said before, they're highly emotional memories. They are remembered for long periods of time, right? So 9/11 occurred 19 years ago, and yet I still remembered the event and was able to give a highly detailed account, right? So not only are these highly emotional, but our memory for them seems to endure over time. Right? But as my deeply flawed account of where I was on 9/11 would suggest, right? Despite the fact that these memories are highly detailed and very vivid and seem to endure over time, they're often highly inaccurate as well. Okay, so when Brown and Kulik first discovered this notion of flashbulb memories, they were struck again by how detailed people's accounts of these events were. So at the time, I believe their first study, they asked people to describe where they were when they heard about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Right? But a problem with their particular procedure is that when they conducted the study, many years had passed between when the participants were interviewed and when John F. Kennedy's assassination actually took place, right? So even though Brown and Kulik were able to demonstrate that people had continued to retain these memories and that they were highly detailed and very emotional, they weren't able to assess the accuracy of these memories, right? So the only way to assess the accuracy of flashbulb memories is to start interviewing people pretty much immediately after the event takes place, right? And then interview them subsequently after a particular delay to see if the memory stays the same, right? Okay, so one of the researchers that you guys are already familiar with, Ulrich Neisser, was responsible for overcoming this accuracy issue because he was able to interview people immediately after a highly emotional, widely publicized event, right? So this highly emotional, widely publicized event was the Challenger disaster, right? So in this particular disaster, or when this particular disaster occurred, the space shuttle named the Challenger was launching, and this was a highly publicized event because it was the first space shuttle launch to include civilians, right? So normally when spacecrafts are launched, they include, scientists and astronauts and people like that who are in the field, so to speak. But in this particular case, they actually took several K through 12 teachers up on the spacecraft with them. And in this particular case, the children at the schools where these teachers worked were invited to watch the launching of the spacecraft. And due to a variety of technical failures, the space shuttle sort of immediately fell apart or came apart upon launching, and all of the people aboard the spacecraft passed away, right? So it's a highly, highly tragic, widely publicized event. Nizer and colleagues were able to start interviewing people about where they were when they heard about the event one day after the event occurred. And so what they did is they interviewed them immediately after it occurred, and then they continually interviewed them for as long as 2.5 to 3 years after the event occurred. And so the idea is that the first interview is going to be what actually occurred, or the closest thing to what actually occurred. And by looking at subsequent recollections and looking at the potential differences between the first recollection and the subsequent recollection, we can assess how accurate flashbulb memories actually are. So this is a technique called repeated recall. Just asking people immediately after the event and asking them after subsequent delays to assess whether their future memory for the circumstances surrounding the event is the same or whether it's subject to distortion. Okay, so this is an example of a recollection or a report, if you will, from somebody, from one of Nizer's participants immediately after, the day after the event. Okay, so it says, I was in my religion class and some people walked in and started talking about it. I don't know any details except that it had exploded and the school teacher's students had all been watching, which was sad. Then after class, I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it and got all the details from that. Okay, so let's compare that first recollection to one that's given 2.5 years later. Okay, so the person says, when I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate and we were watching TV. It came on a news flash and we were both totally shocked. I was really upset and I went upstairs to talk to a friend of mine and then I called my parents. Right? So right away we see that while the emotional component is still present, right, many of the details have now become distorted. So when they compared the percentage of people who indicated first hearing about it on TV, initially, right after the explosion, only about 20% of participants indicated that they heard about the disaster on TV. But 2.5 years later, that number rose to 45%, right? So what that suggests is that that's one example of a common distortion. And one of the reasons that this distortion might occur is because, again, these are highly publicized events that are frequently reported in the media for days and days and weeks and years on end, right? So it could just simply be a source memory error, right? So because people have these repetitions of seeing news broadcasts, right? That's their most memorable experience of hearing about the event, right? They see it on TV, on multiple channels, multiple news broadcasts over and over again. So that memory replaces the original memory for where they were when the event occurred. Right? So this kind of relates to what Ulrich Neisser referred to as the narrative rehearsal process. So one of the reasons why people show an enhanced memory or a memory for these types of events that endures for years and years on end, it's not because we have a specialized cognitive mechanism, if you will, but rather because of a very ordinary mechanism that we can invoke when we're talking about flashbulb memories or when we're talking about regular memories, and that is the power of rehearsal, right? So anytime we have anytime we have repetitions of a particular event, whether we invoke those repetitions ourselves in the process of rehearsal, like we do when we're encoding information from short-term memory to long-term memory, or when we see repetitions in the news media, right? Our memory for what's repeated is going to get enhanced, right? So with flashbulb memories, these highly emotional, highly tragic events are going to get played and replayed in the media, right? So that's basically a constitute for repeated rehearsal, and that repeated rehearsal leads to enhanced memory, right? So Neisser and others say there's nothing particular about these memories. There's nothing in the brain or nothing in the mind that leads to enhanced recollection, right? Just like any other memories, the more you hear about it or the more you visit it over and over and over again, okay, the better your memory for that event's going to be, right? But your memory for the original event is only going to be accurate if that's the thing that gets repeated over and over and over again, right? But often it isn't, right? What gets repeated is whatever is played on the newsreel, right? So the planes hitting the building as the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, as with the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or the bullets hitting John F. Kennedy when he's driving his car in the motorcade. Whatever events are framed and repeated in the media, those are the things that you're more likely to recall. So further evidence in favor of the narrative rehearsal hypothesis, or the notion that the reason why flashbulb memories are more recallable is because of the repetitions that we get from the media, comes from a study conducted by James Ost and colleagues. So this particular study wasn't asking people to remember where they were when they heard about 9/11 or when they heard about the Challenger. It was referring to another highly publicized event, which was the death of Princess Diana. So for those of you who don't remember or weren't, I guess most of you weren't alive, but those of you that haven't heard about Princess Diana and how she passed away, it was, again, highly unexpected, highly tragic. She was in a car with her assistant, and the car was hit by sort of a band of paparazzis who were pursuing her. Okay, so it was a car accident that was basically caused by paparazzi, or people wanting to get video of her. So in this particular study, what the researchers asked is they asked participants whether or not they had seen a paparazzi video recording of the car crash. And of the 45 people that the researchers interviewed, 20 said that they had seen the film. Okay? But the problem was that this film didn't actually exist, right? So this car crash was reported on TV, but the crash itself wasn't actually shown to the public. So why on earth would people falsely recall seeing this crash? Well, one of the reasons is because of the extensive media coverage that followed this event, right? So people were very, very familiar with watching all of the newsreels and video footage surrounding the event. And in fact, what was shown in the media was what they would sort of rehearse or practice over and over and over again. So it made sense that they would have been exposed to such an event or such a video in the media, but it turns out that that actual video didn't exist. Okay. So the best way to understand flashbulb memories, or again, sort of going back to what features characterize flashbulb memories, has to do with a particular study that was conducted by researchers at the University of Texas. So these particular researchers, kind of similar to what Ulrich Neisser did, is they actually interviewed people the day after 9/11, okay? And they interviewed them again either 6 weeks later or 36 weeks later. And they essentially asked them to again recall the circumstances in which they heard about 9/11. So not only did they ask them for information about the circumstances surrounding 9/11, but they also asked them to report on sort of mundane, everyday events that occurred on that day as well, right? So they might ask them, what were you doing, or where were you going, what were you wearing, those kinds of things. So they asked them what they were doing when they found out about 9/11, sort of more mundane, everyday events that occurred on that particular day. And they also asked them to come up with some cue words to help them recall the everyday events. Okay? And again, they were interviewed the day after 9/11, 6 weeks after, or 36 weeks after. Okay? And they were looking at memory for the everyday events and the flashbulb events, or the events surrounding 9/11. Okay? And they were looking at the number of details that they could generate. They were looking at how vivid their memory for those events were on a 7-point scale. And they were also looking at their confidence that the memories were accurate on a 7-point scale. And what they found is that over time, as the days after the event continued, or as the retention interval, or the time between 9/11 and the time in which they were tested increased, is that the number of details they could recall for both flashbulb memories and the everyday events went down. Okay, so over time, the memories for both the flashbulb memories and the everyday events became less detailed. However, the amount of vividness evoked by the memories associated with 9/11 remained quite high, and people's belief in the accuracy of those flashbulb memories remained high as well. And in fact, in some cases, it actually increased, right? So what this means is that in reality, the number of details that we're able to recall and the accuracy with which we're able to recall flashbulb memories is comparable to our accuracy for normal memories or everyday events. Okay, that doesn't change. They are indistinguishable from each other. However, what is different about flashbulb memories is we experience them much more vividly than we do everyday events. Okay, so they're highly vivid, highly emotional. Okay, and we are also very, very confident that our memory is accurate for those events. Okay, so that's really what distinguishes flashbulb memories from memories for everyday events, is not the quality of what we remember or the accuracy, okay, because that's comparable to everyday memories. So they're forgotten at the same rate and with the same degree of inaccuracy as regular memories, right? What makes them different is our confidence as to whether they're true or not, and also how vivid or rich the representations that we formed surrounding those events are. Okay, so flashbulb memories are just as inaccurate and just as poorly remembered as regular events. Okay, but they're far more vivid, and we have a lot more confidence that what we're remembering is true. Okay, guys, so that concludes our final discussion of autobiographical memory. Certainly feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And I'll be posting more information about the 7 sense of memory next week. All right, take care, guys.